Late August, 1944. Imagine a German field marshal's command post somewhere in France. The air is thick with the smell of stale cigar smoke and defeat. But on the massive map table, a glimmer of hope is emerging. General Feld Marshal Walter Model, a man known for his grim tenacity, points a finger at the rapidly advancing Allied lines. They're stretching thin, like a rubber band pulled to its breaking point. His intelligence officers, the G2s, are all saying the same thing. The Americans, particularly Patton's hard-charging Third Army, have done the impossible. They've broken out of the Normandy pocket and are racing across France. But in doing so, they've committed a cardinal sin of warfare. They have outrun their supply lines. This wasn't just a theory. It was a fundamental law of military science. An army, especially a modern, mechanized army, is a hungry beast. It devours fuel, ammunition, food, and spare parts at a terrifying rate. Every mile it advances, the logistical tail that feeds it gets longer and more fragile. The German High Command knew this better than anyone. They had learned this bitter lesson themselves on the vast, unforgiving plains of Russia. Their own blitzkrieg had stalled at the gates of Moscow, not just because of the winter, but because their supply trucks couldn't keep up. Now, they were seeing the same classic pattern repeat itself with their enemies. The Americans were hundreds of miles from their only functioning deep-water port at Cherbourg. And Cherbourg itself was a wreck, thoroughly demolished by its German defenders before surrendering. The French railway system, the lifeblood of logistics in Europe, had been systematically destroyed by Allied air power and the French resistance in the lead-up to D-Day. A brilliant strategy to isolate the Normandy battlefield, but now, a self-inflicted wound. The trucks the Allies had were simply not enough. It was a mathematical certainty. You can't run hundreds of thousands of men and tens of thousands of vehicles on a trickle of supplies. So, the German generals watched the map and waited. They expected the American spearheads to sputter, to slow down, and finally, to grind to a halt. It was inevitable. Then, they could reform their lines, bring up their panzer reserves, and deliver a devastating counterattack. The war was not over yet. They were confident. From their perspective, based on a century of military doctrine, the Allied logistical situation was not just difficult. It was impossible. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly imagine, was that the Americans were about to break the laws of military science. They were about to unleash a weapon the Germans had no counter for, because it wasn't a tank or a plane. It was an idea, a river of steel and rubber, flowing day and night, that would change the course of the war in the West. Let's switch perspectives. Jump across the lines to the Allied camp. The mood isn't one of impending doom, but of incredible frustration. It's the agony of being a victim of your own success. General George S. Patton is practically chewing the scenery. His Third Army has been performing miracles, covering 60 miles on some days, smashing German divisions, and taking tens of thousands of prisoners. His tanks, his beloved M4 Shermans, are poised to plunge deep into the heart of Germany. There's just one problem. Most of them are sitting silent on the side of French roads. Their fuel tanks are bone dry. His staff officers are going mad, fielding constant, desperate calls from the front. We need gas. We need ammo. We need rations. The G4, the chief logistics officer, can only shrug his shoulders. The supplies aren't there. This wasn't a minor hiccup. It was a full-blown crisis that threatened to derail the entire Allied strategy. The breakout from Normandy, the operation codenamed Cobra, had shattered the German front. What was supposed to be a grinding battle of attrition had turned into a stunning war of movement. The Allied planners in London had prepared for a slow advance, painstakingly rebuilding ports and railways as they went. They had war-gamed a scenario where they might reach the Seine River by D+90, meaning 90 days after the 6th of June landings. Instead, Patton's forward elements were approaching the Seine just a few weeks into August. The strategic success was so profound, so far beyond the most optimistic projections, that the logistical system designed to support it simply broke. The numbers were staggering. A single American infantry division required over 600 tons of supplies per day to stay in the fight. An armored division, like the ones spearheading Patton's advance, needed nearly double that, mostly in the form of gasoline. The Third Army alone was projected to consume 800,000 gallons of fuel every single day to maintain its momentum. That's enough to fill over 120 modern tanker trucks. And it all had to come from the beaches of Normandy or the battered port of Cherbourg, hundreds of miles away, over roads cratered by bombs and clogged with the debris of war. The situation was so dire that the Allied command was forced to make an agonizing choice. They had to prioritize. General Eisenhower, the supreme commander, had to decide which of his star generals would get the lion's share of the precious fuel. Would it be the methodical British Field Marshal Montgomery in the north, or the flamboyant, aggressive Patton in the south? This rivalry created immense friction, but it stemmed from a simple, brutal reality. There wasn't enough to go around for everyone. The great Allied war machine, the most powerful military force ever assembled, was being starved into inaction. It was a paradox of victory. And as German commanders looked at their maps and smiled, the Allied commanders looked at theirs with a sense of dread. Something had to be done, and it had to be done now. The solution, when it came, would be as audacious and unconventional as the breakout itself. In the rear echelons, far from the roar of the tanks, a group of staff officers were facing this logistical nightmare head-on. They were the men of the Army Service Forces, the unsung logisticians and planners, whose work was far from glamorous, but absolutely essential. They knew the railways were a lost cause for now. They knew the ports were a bottleneck. The only answer lay with the truck. But simply throwing more trucks at the problem wasn't a solution. The roads were chaotic. Supply convoys were getting mixed up with troop movements, civilian traffic, and combat units. Convoys would get lost, break down, or be ambushed. What was needed was not just more trucks, but a system. A radical, all-encompassing system to turn the roads of France into a massive conveyor belt. The idea began to crystallize in early August. The credit for the concept is often shared, but a key figure was Colonel Loren "Red" Ayres of the Motor Transport Service. He and his team realized that to move the sheer volume of supplies required, they couldn't just run intermittent convoys. They needed a continuous, non-stop loop. The concept was inspired by the American railroad system. Back home, when a shipment was critical, it was marked with a red ball. This meant it had absolute priority. It would not be sidetracked. All other traffic had to yield. That's where the name came from, the Red Ball Express. The plan was breathtaking in its simplicity and its scale. They would designate two main routes from the supply dumps near Saint-Lô, the heart of the Normandy logistical area, eastward toward the front lines around Chartres. One route would be for northbound traffic, carrying the supplies to the front. The other, a parallel route, would be for the southbound return trip of empty trucks. This would create a gigantic one-way loop, hundreds of miles long. All civilian traffic and all other military traffic would be banned from these red ball highways. This was a controversial move, as it would severely disrupt local life and other military operations. But the need was absolute. The roads would belong exclusively to the Express. Furthermore, the Express would run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, in all weather. There would be no stopping. Drivers would be pushed to the absolute limit. Trucks would be driven until they literally fell apart. The goal was to create a constant, pulsating flow of material to the front, a veritable fire hose of gasoline and ammunition. The plan was drawn up with incredible speed. It was presented to Lieutenant General John C. H. Lee, the commander of the Communications Zone, and quickly approved. From there, it went up the chain to the Supreme Headquarters. General Eisenhower himself saw the plan and immediately grasped its importance. He gave it his full backing. On August 21, 1944, the order was given. The Red Ball Express was to be operational in just 4 days. It was a monumental undertaking. They had to gather thousands of trucks, organize drivers, set up maintenance depots, secure the routes, and coordinate the entire thing. It seemed impossible. But for the men on the ground, impossible was just another problem to be solved. The beast of the American Army was starving, and the Red Ball Express was going to be the one to feed it. The heart and soul of the Red Ball Express was not a man, but a machine. It was a rugged, unassuming, and utterly dependable vehicle, the GMC CCKW 2.5-ton truck. To the soldiers who drove it, maintained it, and relied on it, it was known simply as the Jimmy or the Deuce and a Half. There is a strong argument to be made that this humble truck was one of the most important pieces of military hardware of the entire war. Without it, the Allied advance across Europe would have been impossible. It was the logistical workhorse that carried the army on its back. The Jimmy was not a complicated piece of technology. It was designed for mass production and reliability, not comfort or speed. It had a simple 6-cylinder engine, a manual transmission, and a distinct lack of creature comforts. The cab was drafty, the seats were hard, and the ride was bone-jarring. But it was tough. It could carry its designated 2.5-ton load over pristine highways, and, crucially, it could carry it through mud, over shell-cratered roads, and across improvised bridges. With its 6-wheel drive, it could go places that would stop lesser vehicles in their tracks. By 1944, the American military had over 500,000 of these trucks in service around the world. For the Red Ball Express, the Army scrounged up every available Jimmy they could find in the European theater. The initial fleet consisted of nearly 6,000 of these vehicles. Imagine that number for a moment. 6,000 trucks, dedicated to a single, continuous operation. If you line them up bumper to bumper, with a standard convoy interval, the line would stretch for well over 100 miles. This was the scale the Germans simply could not fathom. The drivers had a love-hate relationship with their Jimmies. They hated the punishing ride and the constant, deafening roar of the engine. But they loved its stubborn refusal to quit. These trucks took an incredible amount of punishment. They were overloaded, driven for thousands of miles without proper maintenance, and operated by exhausted men. Axles broke, tires blew, and engines overheated. But more often than not, the Jimmies just kept going. They were often loaded with 5 tons or more, double their official capacity. The rear leaf springs would be flattened out, but the truck would still move. The standard cargo was 60 drums of gasoline, or a similar weight in ammunition crates, K-rations, or medical supplies. The sight of these olive-drab trucks, caked in French dust, became the defining image of the Allied logistical effort. Each one was a critical link in the chain. A single truck, delivering its load of fuel, could get a platoon of Sherman tanks moving again. A truckload of artillery shells could support an attack on a German strongpoint. A truckload of blood plasma could save the lives of wounded soldiers. The GMC CCKW was not as glamorous as a P-51 Mustang, or as fearsome as a Sherman tank, but it was the lifeblood of the Allied armies. The Red Ball Express was about to test this incredible machine, and the men who drove it to the absolute breaking point. A machine is nothing without an operator. The 6,000 Jimmies of the Red Ball Express needed drivers. At least 2 for every truck, to keep them running around the clock. That's 12,000 men. Where did they come from? The answer to that question reveals a complex and often overlooked aspect of the American war effort. The vast majority of the Red Ball Express drivers, roughly 75%, were African American soldiers. In the segregated army of 1944, Black soldiers were typically barred from combat roles. They were usually assigned to service and supply units, quartermaster companies, engineer battalions, and transport corps. It was a reflection of the deep-seated racism of the era. The military leadership, reflecting the biases of society, often considered black soldiers to be unsuited for the rigors of frontline combat. So, while their white counterparts were fighting in infantry and armored divisions, these men were tasked with the less glorious, but equally vital, jobs of digging ditches, loading ships, and driving trucks. They were the backbone of the logistical system. When the call went out to man the Red Ball Express, it was these segregated quartermaster and transportation corps units that answered. For many of these men, driving a truck was the primary skill they had been trained for in the Army. They came from all over America. They were sharecroppers from Mississippi, factory workers from Detroit, and clerks from New York. They had joined the Army to fight for their country, a country that still treated them as second-class citizens. They faced discrimination not just from society back home, but within the very Army they served. They slept in segregated barracks, ate at segregated mess halls, and were commanded almost exclusively by white officers. Yet, when the moment of crisis arrived, the success of the entire Allied campaign in France rested squarely on their shoulders. They were not combat troops in the traditional sense. They hadn't been trained for infantry tactics or storming machine gun nests. But the job they were about to undertake required a different kind of courage. It required endurance, discipline, and a relentless determination to get the job done. They would face dangers not just from the enemy, but from exhaustion, mechanical failure, and the sheer, grinding monotony of the road. They were given a monumental task under incredible pressure. They were told that the fate of Patton's army, and perhaps the war itself, depended on them. For these thousands of African American soldiers, the Red Ball Express was more than just a mission. It was a chance to prove themselves, to show their worth, and to contribute in a direct and tangible way to the defeat of Nazi Germany. They grabbed their helmets, climbed into the cabs of their Jimmies, and prepared to make history. Organizing 6,000 trucks and 12,000 men into a functioning system in just 4 days was a logistical miracle in itself. The planners knew that the key to success was rigid, absolute control. The Red Ball highways could not be allowed to descend into chaos. This meant creating a set of rules and a system of enforcement that was as meticulous as it was massive. The first step was marking the routes. Teams of engineers and military police fanned out across northern France. They plastered signs on every tree, telephone pole, and building at every intersection. The signs were simple: a red ball painted on a yellow or white background, with an arrow pointing the way. For a driver who had been on the road for 18 hours straight, bleary-eyed and half asleep, these simple symbols were a lifeline, guiding them through the labyrinth of unfamiliar French country roads. There was no room for error. A wrong turn couldn't just delay one truck. It could cause a traffic jam that would ripple back for miles, disrupting the entire flow. To prevent this, military police, or MPs, were stationed at every major crossroads and in every town along the route. They were the traffic cops of the express. Their job was to keep the convoys moving and to ensure that no unauthorized vehicles entered the one-way loop. They were given strict orders. The Red Ball has absolute priority. Nothing and no one was to get in its way. This led to some tense situations, with MPs holding up everyone from French civilians to high-ranking officers in their staff cars to let the endless columns of supply trucks roll past. Speed was another critical factor. A strict speed limit of 25 miles per hour was imposed. This was for 2 reasons. First, safety. A 2.5-ton truck, overloaded with high explosive shells or flammable gasoline, was a dangerous vehicle. A crash could be catastrophic. Second, it was to maintain a consistent flow. The goal was to have the trucks spaced 60 yards apart, moving at a steady pace, like cars on a factory assembly line. In reality, this rule was the most frequently broken. Drivers, under pressure to make their delivery times, often pushed their jimmies to 40 miles per hour or more, especially on the open stretches of road. They famously removed the governors from their engines, devices designed to limit the truck's top speed, to get a few extra miles per hour. Along the routes, special depots were established. Every 50 miles or so, there would be a bivouac area with maintenance crews, fuel dumps, and field kitchens. These were supposed to be rest stops, but for most drivers, they were just a place to refuel the truck, grab a quick cup of coffee and a sea ration, and get back on the road. The maintenance crews were the unsung heroes, working 24/7 to patch up wounded trucks. They performed miracles with limited tools and a dwindling supply of spare parts, often cannibalizing one wrecked jimmy to keep two others running. This entire system, the marked routes, the one-way loop, the MP patrols, the strict rules, and the support depots, was the invisible architecture that made the Red Ball Express possible. It turned a collection of individual trucks into a coordinated, unstoppable force. It was a triumph of American organizational skill, imposed upon the war-torn landscape of France. August 25, 1944, 0600 hours. As the sun began to rise over the scarred fields of Normandy, a new sound joined the chorus of war. It wasn't the crump of artillery or the rattle of machine guns. It was the rumble of 6,000 engines turning over, a deep, guttural roar that echoed across the countryside. The Red Ball Express was officially open for business. The first trucks, heavily laden with jerry cans of gasoline and crates of ammunition, pulled out of the massive supply dumps near St. Lo. They were organized into provisional companies, many of them thrown together just days before. The drivers, a mix of nervous young recruits and seasoned veterans, gripped their steering wheels and pointed their vehicles east. That first day was a trial by fire. The system, so neatly drawn on maps in a command tent, now had to function in the real world. And the real world was messy. Despite the careful planning, there was confusion. Some drivers, exhausted before they even began, took wrong turns. Signs were missing in some places. The sheer volume of traffic immediately created bottlenecks in the small French towns, whose narrow medieval streets were never designed for 2.5-ton trucks. The roads themselves were a nightmare. Many were little more than dirt tracks, now being pulverized into fine dust by the constant passage of heavy wheels. The dust was unbelievable. It got into everything: engines, food, eyes, and lungs. It hung in the air like a thick brown fog, cutting visibility down to a few yards and forcing drivers to keep a greater distance, which slowed the whole convoy down. When it rained, the dust turned into a thick, greasy mud that could suck a truck into a ditch in a heartbeat. Breakdowns were constant. Tires, many of them old and worn, blew out with alarming frequency. Engines, pushed to their limits, overheated. Axles, strained by overloading, snapped. On that first day, the shoulders of the Red Ball Highway quickly became a graveyard of dead and dying jimmies. Wrecker crews worked frantically to haul the disabled vehicles out of the way to keep the lanes clear. But despite the chaos, the confusion, and the breakdowns, the river began to flow. Truck by truck, convoy by convoy, the supplies started moving east. The numbers for that first day were modest by the standards the Express would later achieve, but they were a start. The important thing was that the system worked. A truck that left Normandy in the morning could reach the forward supply depots near Chartres by nightfall. The turnaround was the killer. After a grueling 12 to 15-hour drive, unloading the cargo, and a few hours of fitful sleep, the driver and his co-driver would climb back into their empty truck and begin the long journey back to the coast, against the flow of their outbound comrades on the parallel road. The Great Loop was in motion. For the German reconnaissance planes that occasionally flew over the area, what they saw must have been baffling. An unbroken line of trucks, stretching to the horizon, moving east, and another line, just a few miles away, moving west. It wasn't a typical military convoy, which has a beginning and an end. This was something else. This was a perpetual motion machine of logistics. The engine had started. For the men behind the wheel, the Red Ball Express was not a grand strategic concept. It was a blur of endless roads, crushing fatigue, and the constant, mind-numbing drone of a six-cylinder engine. A day in the life of a Red Ball driver was a brutal test of human endurance. The official doctrine called for 2 drivers per truck, allowing them to switch off and rest. In practice, the shortage of personnel meant that many men drove solo, or with a co-driver who was just as exhausted as they were. The schedule was relentless. A round trip from the Normandy dumps to the forward depots and back could take anywhere from 36 to over 50 hours, depending on the traffic, breakdowns, and the ever-receding front line. During that time, sleep was a luxury that few could afford. Drivers learned to catch a few minutes of shut-eye while their truck was being loaded or unloaded. They would pull over for a 10-minute power nap on the side of the road, only to be jolted awake by the horn of a passing truck or the shouts of an MP. To combat the overwhelming exhaustion, the Army issued Benzedrine tablets, an amphetamine known to the drivers as pep pills. They kept the men awake, but they also made them jittery and paranoid, and the crash when the drug wore off was brutal. Coffee, brewed black and thick over small gasoline stoves, was the other fuel that kept the drivers going. Food was whatever you could eat with one hand while driving. The standard C ration, canned hash, biscuits, and hard candy, was the staple. Sometimes, they would get a hot meal at one of the depots, a welcome but brief respite from the cold rations in the cab. The mental strain was just as bad as the physical. The monotony of the journey was soul-crushing. Mile after mile of identical French countryside, the same ruined villages, the same lines of poplar trees. To stay sane, the men would sing, talk to themselves, or tell stories to their co-drivers, shouting over the noise of the engine. The only thing that broke the monotony was the ever-present danger. Every shadow on the side of the road could be a German sniper. Pockets of bypassed German soldiers still operated behind the lines, and they would occasionally take potshots at the convoys. A single bullet in a tire or a fuel tank could be deadly. The biggest danger, however, was not the enemy, but themselves. Drivers constantly fell asleep at the wheel. A moment of nodding off could send a 5-ton truck careening into a ditch or into the back of the truck in front. The roads were littered with the evidence of these fatigue-related accidents. Despite the hardships, a unique culture developed among the drivers. They were proud of their mission. They knew how important it was. They gave their trucks names, painted slogans on the bumpers, and developed a fierce camaraderie. They were the Red Ball drivers, a special breed. They might not have been kicking down doors in Aachen, but they knew that the men who were could only do so because of the gas and bullets they were hauling. It was a grueling, thankless, and incredibly dangerous job. But they did it. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, they kept the wheels turning. The true impact of the Red Ball Express is best understood not through anecdotes, but through the sheer, staggering numbers. What the logisticians and drivers achieved was, on a statistical level, almost unbelievable. It represented a torrent of supplies that completely overwhelmed the German capacity to comprehend, let alone match. At its peak, the Red Ball Express had 5,958 vehicles in operation on any given day. To keep these trucks running, the system required a total of over 23,000 men, including drivers, co-drivers, mechanics, MPs, and support staff. This was the equivalent of nearly 2 full infantry divisions dedicated solely to logistics. The amount of cargo they moved is even more mind-boggling. The initial goal was to deliver 75,000 tons of supplies per week. They quickly surpassed that. On its busiest day, August 29, 1944, the Express moved a record-breaking 12,742 tons of supplies to the front. That's nearly 26 million pounds of material in a single 24-hour period. To put that in perspective, the payload of a modern C-17 Globemaster transport plane is about 85 tons. The Red Ball Express, on its peak day, delivered the equivalent of 150 fully loaded C-17 cargo planes. And they did it with nothing but 2.5-ton trucks on bombed-out roads. Fuel was, by far, the most critical commodity. The thirsty tanks and vehicles of the First and Third Armies were consuming it at an astonishing rate. The Red Ball became Patton's personal pipeline. On average, the Express delivered over 1 million gallons of gasoline to the front every single day. The image of trucks laden with red jerry cans became iconic. But it wasn't just fuel. They carried everything an army needs to fight. Millions of rounds of small arms ammunition, tens of thousands of artillery shells and mortar rounds, crates of hand grenades, tons of K rations and C rations to feed the troops, medical supplies from bandages to blood plasma, and critical spare parts to keep the tanks, jeeps, and artillery pieces functioning. The route itself was a monumental piece of infrastructure. The one-way loop stretched for over 300 miles, and as the front advanced, the route was extended even further. By the end of its operation, the total road network exclusively used by the Red Ball was over 600 miles long. All of this was happening in plain sight. The Germans could see it. Their reconnaissance aircraft, though few and far between, brought back astonishing photos of highways packed, bumper to bumper, with American trucks. Their frontline observers reported an endless, grinding noise that never stopped, day or night. But the numbers were so large, so far beyond their own logistical capabilities, that they struggled to believe it. The German army in 1944 was still heavily reliant on horses for transport. They simply did not have the motor pool or the fuel to replicate such an achievement. This overwhelming, undeniable display of logistical power was a weapon in itself. It was a psychological blow to the German command. It told them that they were not just fighting an army. They were fighting an entire industrial nation, a nation that could conjure a 600-mile-long conveyor belt out of thin air to feed its war machine. The numbers didn't lie. Let's go back to that German command post. In early September, the mood is no longer one of confident waiting. It's one of deep, gnawing confusion. The American advance, which was supposed to have sputtered and died from fuel starvation, has not stopped. In fact, in some sectors, it seems to be accelerating. Patton's Third Army has crossed the Meuse River and is approaching the German border. This should not be happening. The reports coming in from the front and from the air are becoming increasingly bizarre. At first, they are dismissed as exaggerations. A Luftwaffe pilot reports a column of trucks that stretches from horizon to horizon. An infantry officer, captured after his position was overrun, talks about the American truck trains that never end. These are chalked up to battlefield stress, to fear, to the fog of war. The German intelligence analysts, the men of the Fremde Heer West, Foreign Armies West, are trying to make sense of it all. They look at their own logistical models. To supply a single panzer division in high-intensity combat, they need hundreds of tons of supplies per day. Their own truck companies are struggling to keep up, even over short distances. They simply don't have enough trucks, enough fuel, or enough spare parts. They project their own limitations onto the enemy. Their calculations show, with cold, hard logic, that the Americans cannot possibly be sustaining an advance on this scale. Their reports to the High Command are filled with phrases like logistically overextended and imminent operational pause. They are convinced the Allied armies are running on fumes and that the whole offensive is a massive gamble that is about to fail catastrophically. But the frontline reports keep contradicting the analysts' conclusions. A panzer commander on the Moselle River reports that his tanks are immobile due to lack of fuel, while he watches American armored columns race past him, seemingly with no such concerns. A message is intercepted from an American supply depot requesting another 500,000 gallons of 80-octane priority Red Ball. What is Red Ball? The intelligence officers don't know. It's a code name for something they don't understand. The first real glimmer of understanding comes not from high-level analysis, but from simple observation. German patrols and reconnaissance units start noticing the signs. The simple, hand-painted red balls at the crossroads. They notice the one-way flow of traffic. They see the American MPs waving through the supply trucks with frantic urgency. They start to piece it together. This isn't just a series of independent convoys. This is a system. A highly organized, non-stop, dedicated supply route. They still can't grasp the scale. Their own military culture is based on meticulous, long-term planning. The idea of improvising a system of this magnitude in a matter of days is alien to them. They see it, but they don't fully believe it. It's a failure of imagination. They are so trapped in their own doctrine, so convinced of the laws of warfare, that they cannot accept that the Americans are simply rewriting the rulebook. This confusion at the highest levels of the German command is a critical factor. It prevents them from formulating an effective response. While they wait for the inevitable Allied collapse, the Red Ball Express keeps rolling, delivering the fuel and ammunition that turns their strategic calculations into wishful thinking. The German High Command's failure to grasp the reality of the Red Ball Express was rooted in a deep-seated institutional arrogance and a rigid adherence to their own doctrine. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the overall commander in the West, and his chief of staff, General Günther Blumentritt, were brilliant, experienced officers of the old Prussian school. They understood warfare as a science of timetables, railway capacities, and tonnage calculations. The American approach struck them as reckless, amateurish, and unsustainable. Their own logistical system was a marvel of German efficiency, but it was also brittle. It relied heavily on railways. When the railways were cut, as they had been in France, their system faltered. The German army's motor transport capacity was surprisingly limited. A significant portion of their supply train, even in their elite panzer divisions, was still horse-drawn. The idea that an entire army group could be supplied exclusively by truck over hundreds of miles seemed like a fantasy. When the intelligence reports about the endless truck columns first reached them, their reaction was one of disbelief, followed by a search for a rational explanation that fit their worldview. Their first assumption was that it was a temporary, emergency measure. They believed the Allies were burning through their reserve stocks in a desperate, last-ditch gamble to reach the Rhine before their supply chain collapsed completely. Under this assumption, the correct German strategy was to simply hold on, to conduct a fighting withdrawal, and to let the Americans punch themselves out. Every mile the Allies advanced, the Germans reasoned, the logistical noose would tighten. Soon, the American tanks would be stranded, and the German panzers, operating on short, internal supply lines, could strike back. This analysis was logical. It was based on sound military principles, and it was completely wrong. It failed to account for the one factor that the Germans could never truly comprehend: the sheer, overwhelming industrial and organizational power of the United States. The Americans weren't running a desperate gamble. They were employing a new form of industrialized warfare. They were treating logistics not as a constraint, but as a weapon. They were substituting organization and mass production for traditional military caution. The German generals looked at the map and saw overstretched supply lines. The American generals looked at the map and saw a problem that could be solved with more trucks, better organization, and American ingenuity. This fundamental difference in perspective was a microcosm of the entire war. The Germans had started the war with superior tactics and, in many cases, superior equipment. But war is not just about battles. It's about the relentless, grinding business of supply. And in that arena, they were being decisively outmatched. While von Rundstedt and his staff waited for the laws of logistics to bring the Allied juggernaut to a halt, the Red Ball Express was busy rewriting those laws, one truckload at a time. The shock, when the realization finally dawned, would be profound. It was the moment they understood that they weren't just being outfought. They were being overwhelmed by a system they couldn't hope to compete with. Life on the Red Ball Express was a battle against fatigue, but it was also a real battle against a multitude of dangers that lurked along the route. While the front lines had moved far to the east, the French countryside was not entirely safe. The rapid Allied advance had bypassed thousands of German soldiers. These pockets of resistance, ranging from a few determined snipers to entire companies, were scattered throughout the region. They were cut off, without hope of rescue, but many of them were not ready to surrender. For them, the endless columns of supply trucks were tempting targets. A lone sniper with a rifle, hidden in a church tower or a dense patch of woods, could cause havoc. A single, well-aimed shot could kill a driver, sending his truck careening into the ditch and creating a massive traffic jam. Drivers learned to be vigilant, to scan the windows of the buildings they passed, to never stop in an exposed location. Small arms fire would occasionally crackle from the side of the road, forcing drivers to slump down in their seats and step on the gas. The threat was real. Drivers were killed and wounded by these holdouts. The trucks themselves were also targets. A truck full of gasoline was a massive, slow-moving bomb. A single tracer round or a well-thrown grenade could turn it into a raging inferno, killing the crew and potentially setting off a chain reaction if the convoy was packed too tightly. For this reason, drivers were armed. They were issued M1 carbines or even Thompson submachine guns, but using them while trying to control a 10-ton vehicle was nearly impossible. Their best defense was to keep moving. The Luftwaffe, the once mighty German Air Force, was a shadow of its former self by the late summer of 1944. Allied fighters controlled the skies over France. However, lone German fighter bombers, like the Focke-Wulf 190, would sometimes slip through the air cover on daring, low-level raids. The Red Ball highways, clogged with trucks, were an obvious and tempting target. A strafing run could be devastating. The driver's only defense was the .50 caliber machine gun mounted on a ring on the truck's cab roof, but hitting a fast-moving plane from a bouncing truck was a near impossible shot. The greatest enemy, however, remained accidents. The combination of extreme exhaustion, high speeds on poor roads, and mechanical failures was a lethal cocktail. Head-on collisions on the two-way sections, trucks running off the road on sharp curves, rear-end collisions from drivers following too closely. These were daily occurrences. The sight of a wrecked and burning Jimmy on the roadside was a constant, grim reminder of the risks. The military police did their best to control the chaos, but they couldn't be everywhere. The pressure to deliver the goods often overrode safety precautions. For the men of the Red Ball Express, the war was a strange, hybrid experience. They were not frontline infantrymen, but they were constantly in harm's way. They faced the threat of enemy action, but the more pressing danger came from the very nature of their mission. It required a unique form of steady, grinding courage, the will to climb back into the cab, day after day, and face down the dangers of the road. To keep a river flowing, you must maintain its banks. To keep the Red Ball Express rolling, the Army needed another group of unsung heroes, the mechanics of the ordnance and maintenance crews. They were the ones who fought a desperate, round-the-clock battle against metal fatigue, mechanical failure, and the sheer wear and tear of non-stop operation. Their job was one of the most difficult and critical in the entire operation. The GMC Jimmy was a reliable truck, but it was not indestructible. Pushed far beyond its design limits, driven by exhausted men over terrible roads, it was inevitable that things would break. Tires were the #1 casualty. The rough, debris-strewn roads shredded them. A simple flat tire could take a truck out of commission for hours if a crew wasn't nearby. But the problems went far deeper. The constant overloading put immense strain on the vehicle's chassis. Leaf springs would snap, axles would break clean in two, and transmissions would be stripped of their gears. Engines, run continuously for days on end with minimal cooling and often with dirty fuel, would overheat and seize up. The maintenance depots set up along the Red Ball route were like battlefield hospitals for trucks. They were often just a muddy field or a collection of bombed-out buildings. The mechanics worked in appalling conditions, often in the dark, with only the light of a hooded lamp, or in the pouring rain. They were armed with little more than hand tools and an incredible amount of ingenuity. The supply of spare parts was a constant nightmare. The same logistical problems that created the need for the Red Ball Express also meant that new tires, fan belts, and carburetors were in short supply. This forced the mechanics to become masters of improvisation. Cannibalization was the order of the day. A truck with a broken axle and a good engine would be stripped of its engine to fix another truck with a blown motor. 2 or 3 wrecked trucks would be scavenged to create one functional one. This graveyard of cannibalized Jimmys became a common sight along the route. The mechanics called it the deadline, where trucks went to die or be reborn. They were incredibly creative. They fabricated parts from scrap metal. They patched up cracked engine blocks with special cement. They rewired entire electrical systems using whatever they could find. A popular story, perhaps apocryphal but illustrating the spirit of the mechanics, tells of a crew using a leather belt from a soldier's trousers to replace a broken fan belt, allowing a critical load of blood plasma to get to the front. The pressure on these men was immense. Every truck they could get back on the road meant more fuel for Patton's tanks, more shells for the artillery. They worked side by side with the drivers, sharing the same exhaustion and the same sense of urgency. Without their tireless, greasy, and often frustrating work, the river of steel would have quickly dwindled to a trickle. The Red Ball Express was as much a triumph of the wrench as it was of the wheel. So, what was the actual tangible result of this monumental effort? The answer can be found at the tip of the spear, with the frontline combat units of General Patton's Third Army. For them, the Red Ball Express was not an abstract concept. It was a lifeline. It was the difference between victory and defeat, between a lightning advance and a frustrating static defense. Imagine being a young tank commander in the 4th Armored Division in early September 1944. Your Sherman tank, a 33-ton beast, has an operational range of about 100 miles on a full tank of gas. You've been advancing so fast for so long that the fuel trucks just can't keep up. The order comes down the radio. Halt in place. Conserve fuel. Await resupply. It's the most frustrating order a tanker can receive. You can see the enemy, disorganized and retreating, just a few miles ahead. You have the momentum. A final push could break them completely. But your fuel gauge is on empty. Your powerful war machine is now just a stationary steel pillbox. The silence is maddening. Then, in the distance you hear it, a low rumble that grows into a roar. And over the crest of a hill comes a sight for sore eyes. A long, dusty column of GMC trucks, each one with that beautiful hand-painted red ball on its bumper. The trucks pull up and the drivers, their faces caked with dust and etched with fatigue, jump out and start rolling off 55-gallon drums of gasoline. They work with a desperate urgency, manhandling the heavy drums to your tank. You and your crew form a human chain, using hand pumps to get the precious liquid from the drums into your tank's fuel cells. It's a slow, grueling process, but with every gallon you can feel the life returning to your machine. Within a few hours, the red ball trucks are gone, heading back for another load, and your tank's engine is roaring back to life. The order comes over the radio. Advance to contact. The momentum is restored. This scene was repeated thousands of times all across the front. Patton himself was acutely aware of his army's dependence on the express. He famously said, "My men can eat their belts, but my tanks have got to have gas." He had a tempestuous relationship with the logisticians in the rear, constantly demanding more than they could possibly deliver. But he knew that his entire philosophy of aggressive, mobile warfare was predicated on the success of the Red Ball Express. The trucks delivered more than just fuel. They brought the artillery shells that pounded German defenses into submission before an infantry assault. They brought the machine gun belts that allowed his soldiers to maintain fire superiority. They brought the rations that gave his men the energy to keep fighting. The Red Ball Express was the logistical spear that allowed Patton's tactical spear to keep thrusting forward. It directly translated the industrial might of America into combat power on the front lines of Europe. The story of the Red Ball Express is one of triumph and ingenuity, but it's crucial to acknowledge the immense human cost of the operation. This cost was not primarily measured in combat casualties, but in the relentless, grinding toll that the mission took on the men and machines involved. The pressure to keep the supplies flowing was so intense that safety often became a secondary concern. The most immediate and tragic cost was the high rate of accidents. Drivers, pushed to the brink of human endurance and often driving for 36 hours or more with little to no sleep, would simply pass out at the wheel. The results were horrific. A truck carrying ammunition could veer off the road and explode, vaporizing the driver. A gasoline tanker could crash and burn, creating an inferno that was impossible to escape. Head-on collisions on dark, narrow roads were common. The official statistics on casualties are difficult to parse, as they were often lumped in with other non-combat losses. But the anecdotal evidence from veterans is clear. The Red Ball highways were incredibly dangerous places. The number of men killed or seriously injured in vehicle accidents was significant. The mechanical cost was equally staggering. The GMC trucks were driven without mercy. The concept of routine maintenance was a luxury that couldn't be afforded. They were refueled, reloaded, and sent back out on the road. Engines were run until they seized. Transmissions were shifted until they shattered. And tires were used until they blew apart. The operational loss rate for vehicles was astronomical. By the end of its run, a significant percentage of the initial fleet of nearly 6,000 trucks had been driven into the ground, either destroyed in accidents or simply worn out beyond repair. This was a calculated cost. The Army viewed these trucks as expendable assets, tools to be used up in the pursuit of victory. There was also a less tangible, psychological cost. The constant stress, the lack of sleep, the poor nutrition, and the sheer monotony of the job took a heavy toll on the drivers. This was before the concept of combat stress was fully understood. But many men suffered from what would today be recognized as severe exhaustion and psychological strain. They were pushed to their absolute mental and physical limits, day after day, for months. This aspect of the Red Ball story is often overlooked in the more heroic tellings, but it's vital for a complete understanding. The success of the operation was built on the willingness of the high command to push both men and machines past their breaking points. The drivers and mechanics paid a heavy price for their critical contribution to the war effort, a price measured in broken bodies, shattered nerves, and wrecked machines. It serves as a grim reminder that even in the most successful of military operations, there is always a steep and painful cost. The Red Ball Express did not operate in a vacuum. Its routes cut a massive swathe across the French countryside, and the lives of the French civilians who had just been liberated were profoundly impacted by this non-stop river of steel. Their reaction was a mixture of awe, gratitude, and considerable disruption. For many French people in the small towns and villages along the route, the Red Ball Express was their first real encounter with the American Army, and by extension, with America itself. And what they saw was an astonishing spectacle of power and plenty. After 4 years of German occupation, with its strict rationing, requisitions, and the constant presence of a foreign army, the sight of the Red Ball was almost beyond belief. It was an endless parade of new trucks, laden with a seemingly infinite supply of goods. It was a visible, tangible symbol of the industrial might that was liberating their country. The generosity of the American drivers became legendary. Despite strict orders not to, many drivers would toss bars of chocolate, packs of cigarettes, or cans of rations to the crowds of children who gathered by the roadside to watch the convoys pass. These small acts of kindness forged a powerful bond between the soldiers and the civilians. For a generation of French children, the words chocolate and chewing gum were their first English phrases. The drivers, in turn, were often welcomed into French homes during their brief stops, offered a glass of wine or a piece of bread, precious commodities in a country struggling to get back on its feet. There was another layer to this interaction that was revolutionary for many of the French. A large percentage of the drivers were African American. In the largely homogeneous, rural France of the 1940s, many of these civilians had never seen a black person before. They saw these men not as segregated soldiers, but as American liberators. The drivers were often treated with a warmth and respect that they had rarely, if ever, experienced back in the United States. This experience was transformative for many of the soldiers, giving them a glimpse of a society free from the Jim Crow segregation they knew at home. However, the Express also brought significant disruption. The designation of the Red Ball highways meant that all local traffic was banned. A farmer might be cut off from his fields on the other side of the road. A doctor might be unable to make a house call. This caused real hardship and resentment. The heavy trucks destroyed the local roads, which were not built for such traffic. The constant noise and dust, 24 hours a day, made life difficult for those living alongside the routes. But on the whole, these were seen as minor inconveniences, a small price to pay for liberation. The overwhelming sentiment was one of gratitude. The Red Ball Express was more than just a logistical operation. It was a powerful piece of public diplomacy. It demonstrated American power and generosity in a way no propaganda poster ever could. Faced with this undeniable and seemingly unstoppable logistical torrent, what did the Germans do? Did they try to stop it? The answer is yes, they did. But their efforts were largely sporadic and ineffective. Their failure to interdict the Red Ball Express speaks volumes about the state of the German war machine in the West by late 1944. The most obvious way to stop a truck convoy is from the air. The long, densely packed lines of the Red Ball Express should have been a dream target for German fighter bombers. A few well-placed bombs could have blocked a road for hours, destroyed dozens of trucks, and created utter chaos. But by this stage of the war, the Luftwaffe was on life support. Allied air superiority was so complete that any German plane that took to the skies was immediately swarmed by P-47s and P-51s. The German Air Force simply did not have the planes, the fuel, or the experienced pilots to mount a sustained campaign against the Red Ball routes. The occasional raid that did get through caused damage, but it was a pinprick, not a crippling blow. The next option was to attack on the ground. This was also fraught with difficulty. The German army was in a full-scale retreat. They had no cohesive front line. Their units were shattered, disorganized, and desperately trying to fall back to the safety of the German border. They didn't have the spare troops or the intelligence capability to mount major raids into the Allied rear. The small pockets of bypassed soldiers who did attack the convoys were a nuisance, not a strategic threat. They could knock out a few trucks here and there, but they couldn't stop the flow. Sabotage was another potential weapon. German agents or sympathizers could have mined the roads or ambushed trucks. But the French resistance, which had been so effective at sabotaging the Germans before D-Day, was now working closely with the Allies. They provided crucial intelligence and security along the routes, reporting suspicious activity and helping to round up German stragglers. The sheer scale and redundancy of the Red Ball system also made it resilient. It wasn't a single, vulnerable pipeline. It was a massive, flexible network of roads. If one road was blocked by a raid, or a bridge was blown, the convoys could be quickly rerouted by the MPs. The continuous, 24-hour nature of the operation also made it hard to target. There was no single, main convoy to attack. It was a constant, dispersed stream. Ultimately, the Germans couldn't stop the Red Ball Express because they were overwhelmed. They were fighting a defensive battle on 100 different fronts. Their resources were stretched to the breaking point. The Red Ball was just one problem among many, and they simply didn't have the means to solve it. Their inability to interfere with this vital Allied artery was a clear sign of their growing impotence. The river of supplies continued to flow, almost completely untouched by the enemy. By mid-September, the confusion in the German High Command was beginning to curdle into a horrifying realization. The imminent operational pause they had been predicting for weeks had never materialized. The Americans were now on the German border, fighting in the Hürtgen forest and laying siege to the city of Aachen. This was a strategic impossibility, according to their own analysis. The moment of truth can be imagined in the office of a high-ranking German logistics officer, a general major of the Quartermaster Corps. For weeks, he has been telling his superiors that the enemy cannot sustain this pace. Now, the evidence to the contrary is undeniable. On his desk are the latest intelligence summaries. Reports from Luftwaffe pilots, however rare, describe the highways of France as crawling with trucks, like ants. Intercepted radio traffic speaks of daily fuel deliveries in the hundreds of thousands of gallons. Prisoner interrogations yield fantastical stories of a Red Ball system that runs day and night, without stopping. He pulls out a map and a calculator. He knows the fuel consumption of an American Sherman tank. He knows the approximate number of tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces in Patton's Third Army. He plots their location on the map, hundreds of miles from their supply base in Normandy. He does the math. The tonnage required per day is astronomical. He then looks at his own ledgers, at the state of the German supply system. He sees requests for fuel that can't be filled, for ammunition that doesn't exist. He sees his own truck companies operating at 50% strength due to breakdowns and fuel shortages. The contrast is stark, brutal, and undeniable. The Americans are not just breaking the rules of logistics. They are operating in a different reality. The realization that dawns on him is far more terrifying than the loss of any single battle. It's the understanding that Germany is being crushed by an industrial and organizational force that it cannot possibly hope to match. It's not about the quality of the soldiers or the genius of the commanders anymore. It's about the ability to produce, transport, and deliver the materials of war on a scale that defies imagination. The Red Ball Express becomes a symbol of this horrifying truth. It's a relentless, grinding machine that represents the full weight of American power. This German general understands that every truck that reaches the front is another nail in the coffin of the Third Reich. The shock is profound. It's a psychological defeat that precedes the military one. It's the moment when a professional soldier, trained in the art of war, realizes that his art is being rendered obsolete by the science of mass production and logistics. The war, from this perspective, is already lost. The rest is just a matter of time. This dawning horror in the minds of the German command was one of the most significant, if invisible, victories of the Red Ball Express. Woven into the larger story of logistics and strategy is a deeply personal and powerful human story. The experience of the thousands of African American soldiers who made the Red Ball Express work. Their story is a paradox. They were performing one of the most critical missions of the war in Europe, yet they did so while serving in a racially segregated army that denied them the basic rights and respect afforded to their white counterparts. For these men, the Red Ball Express was a double battle. They were fighting to defeat Nazi Germany, a regime built on a hateful ideology of racial supremacy. At the same time, they were fighting a daily battle for dignity and recognition within their own military. The irony was not lost on them. They were fighting for a freedom abroad that they were denied at home and even in the barracks and mess halls of the U.S. Army in Europe. Despite this, they performed their duties with incredible professionalism and dedication. The brutal, non-stop pace of the Red Ball demanded everything they had. They drove through exhaustion, fear, and loneliness, motivated by a sense of duty and a fierce pride in their work. They knew that the white soldiers in the foxholes, men who might harbor prejudiced views, were depending on them for the ammunition in their rifles and the fuel in their tanks. This shared dependency of the battlefield created a strange and complex dynamic. The performance of the Red Ball drivers directly challenged the racist stereotypes that were prevalent in the Army. The official narrative often claimed that black soldiers lacked the discipline, intelligence, and courage for demanding military tasks. The Red Ball Express proved that to be a vicious lie. Here were thousands of black soldiers executing a highly complex and dangerous mission with remarkable success, day in and day out. Their efficiency and endurance were undeniable. This did not go unnoticed. Some white officers and soldiers who worked alongside the Red Ball units, or who saw them in action, had their prejudices shaken. They saw firsthand the skill and determination of the drivers and mechanics. General Patton, not known for his progressive racial views, famously acknowledged their contribution, stating that his army would not have been able to advance without them. However, this battlefield respect did not translate into institutional change overnight. The drivers of the Red Ball Express were still sent back to segregated facilities at the end of their long hauls. They were often passed over for promotions and awards. But their legacy was profound. The stellar performance of African American soldiers in logistical roles like the Red Ball Express, and later in combat when the Army was forced to desegregate some units due to manpower shortages, provided powerful evidence for those who argued for the full integration of the armed forces. That change would come a few years after the war, with President Truman's executive order in 1948. The men of the Red Ball Express were pioneers. They were fighting a war on two fronts, and their victory was not just in the tons of supplies delivered, but in the stereotypes they shattered, and the path they paved for future generations. The Red Ball Express, born out of a crisis, was not a static entity. It was a dynamic, living system that had to constantly adapt to the changing realities of the war. As the Allied armies pushed further east, the logistical tail grew ever longer, and the demands on the system increased. The original loop from Saint-Lô to Chartres was just the beginning. As the front moved towards the German border, new routes had to be established. The Express extended its reach to supply cities like Reims and Soissons. Planners and engineers were constantly surveying new roads, putting up the ubiquitous Red Ball signs, and establishing new depots. The system became more sophisticated over time. The Army learned valuable lessons from the chaotic early days. Traffic control was tightened. More MPs were assigned to the routes to crack down on speeding and reckless driving. Better maintenance schedules, though still inadequate, were implemented. Mobile repair units were created that could roam the highways, fixing breakdowns on the spot instead of waiting for a wrecker. Communication was improved, with radio-equipped jeeps patrolling the routes to report traffic jams or enemy activity, allowing for rapid rerouting of convoys. The success of the Red Ball concept inspired other, similar operations. When the city of Paris was liberated in late August, a new logistical challenge arose, feeding the city's 2 million inhabitants. To meet this need, the White Ball Express was created, a dedicated supply route using many of the same drivers and trucks to haul food and other civilian necessities into the French capital. As other Allied armies advanced, they created their own express routes, such as the Green Diamond Express and the Red Lion Express, all of which were based on the model pioneered by the original Red Ball. One of the biggest challenges was the turnaround time. A truck is only useful when it's carrying a load. The time spent on the return journey, empty, was essentially wasted. To improve efficiency, the logisticians began to organize backhauls. Trucks that had delivered supplies to the front would, on their return journey, pick up salvageable equipment, German prisoners of war, or soldiers who were being rotated out of the line. This made the entire loop more productive. The men also adapted. The drivers became incredibly skilled at navigating the treacherous roads and keeping their battered trucks running. They developed their own informal communication systems and support networks. A driver with a mechanical problem could almost always count on the next truck in the line to stop and offer help. This constant evolution was key to the Red Ball's sustained success. It wasn't just a brute force solution. It was a learning organization, constantly refining its processes to meet the relentless demands of a fast-moving war. Every great logistical feat in history is eventually superseded by a better one. For the Red Ball Express, the writing was on the wall, and it was spelled ANTWERP. The entire reason the Red Ball was necessary was the lack of a major, functioning deep-water port close to the front lines. The Normandy beaches were inefficient for unloading the vast quantities of supplies arriving from Britain and the United States. The port of Cherbourg was helpful, but it was too far away and had been heavily damaged. The ultimate logistical prize in Northwest Europe was the port of Antwerp in Belgium. Antwerp was one of the largest and best-equipped ports in the world. Its extensive docks and railway connections could handle a volume of supplies that dwarfed anything the Normandy beaches or Cherbourg could manage. If the Allies could capture Antwerp intact, their logistical problems would, for the most part, be solved. Supplies could be offloaded directly from massive cargo ships onto trains that could carry them to within a few miles of the front. This would make the long-haul trucking of the Red Ball Express largely redundant. British and Canadian forces captured the city of Antwerp on September 4, 1944. In a stunning stroke of luck, the Belgian resistance had managed to prevent the Germans from demolishing the port facilities. The docks, cranes, and warehouses were all captured intact. It seemed like a miracle. However, there was a catch, and it was a deadly one. While the Allies held the city and the port, the Germans still controlled the banks of the Scheldt estuary, the 70-mile-long waterway that connects Antwerp to the North Sea. A port is useless if ships can't reach it. The Germans, understanding the port's strategic importance, dug in along the Scheldt. They fortified the islands and riverbanks with artillery and machine guns, effectively turning the estuary into a massive killing zone for any ship that tried to pass. What followed was the brutal and often overlooked Battle of the Scheldt. For over 2 months, Canadian, British, and Polish forces fought a grim, attritional battle in terrible conditions, flooded fields, mud, and cold autumn rain, to clear the German defenders from the estuary's banks. It was a bloody and costly campaign, but it was absolutely essential. While this brutal fighting was happening in the north, the Red Ball Express continued its relentless work, keeping the Allied armies supplied for their push towards Germany. But everyone knew it was a temporary solution. The long-term success of the Allied campaign depended on opening Antwerp. Finally, in early November, the last German resistance along the Scheldt was eliminated. The waterway was painstakingly cleared of mines. On November 28, 1944, the first Allied cargo ship, the Canadian-built SS Fort Cataraqui, sailed into the port of Antwerp. The logistical floodgates were now open. The beginning of the end for the Red Ball Express had arrived. By mid-November of 1944, the strategic situation had fundamentally changed. The port of Antwerp was on the verge of opening, and the Allied railway engineers had performed miracles in repairing the French and Belgian rail networks. Trains could now carry the bulk of supplies from the ports and depots much closer to the front lines. The era of the long-haul truck convoy as the primary means of supply was coming to an end. The Red Ball Express, the system that had saved the Allied advance from stalling, was officially scheduled for termination. The final run was set for November 16th. For the drivers and mechanics, the news was met with a mixture of relief, pride, and profound exhaustion. For 83 consecutive days, they had lived and breathed the Red Ball. They had pushed themselves and their vehicles to the very edge of endurance and beyond. The last few weeks had been particularly tough. The autumn weather had set in, bringing cold, driving rain that turned the roads into rivers of mud. The hours of darkness grew longer, making driving even more treacherous. The men were worn out. Their trucks, after tens of thousands of miles of abuse, were barely holding together. That last day had a unique, almost surreal quality. The drivers made their final outbound journeys, their trucks still loaded with the essentials of war. They passed the familiar landmarks, the ruined villages, the makeshift depots, the simple red ball signs that had guided them for months. There was a sense of an ending, of a job well done. On the return trip, the trucks were empty for the last time. As the final convoy rolled back into the depots near Normandy, there was no grand ceremony, no victory parade. There was just the quiet satisfaction of a mission accomplished. The men, covered in grease and grime, climbed out of their cabs one last time. They were gaunt, with dark circles under their eyes, but they had done it. Over its 83-day lifespan, the Red Ball Express had delivered over 412,000 tons of supplies to the front. It had been a lifeline, a symbol of American resolve and ingenuity. It had proven that a modern army could be sustained in a rapid advance by motor transport alone, a concept that had been considered impossible by many military theorists. The Red Ball Express was deactivated, but its component parts, the truck companies, and the drivers, were not. Their work was far from over. They would be absorbed back into the regular Army transportation system. They would continue to haul supplies, though often over shorter distances, right up to the end of the war. They would play a vital role in the Battle of the Bulge, rushing reinforcements and supplies to the besieged town of Bastogne. But the great, non-stop loop, the legendary Red Ball Express itself, was now a part of history. What was the immediate aftermath for the men and machines of the Red Ball Express? With the operation officially concluded, the Army had to take stock of the consequences of 83 days of non-stop, high-intensity logistics. The human toll was the most immediate concern. The thousands of drivers and mechanics were physically and mentally shattered. They were given a brief period of rest and recuperation, a chance to get a few consecutive nights of sleep, a hot meal that wasn't eaten out of a can, and a respite from the constant roar of the engine. For many, this was their first real break since landing in Normandy months earlier. However, the war waited for no one. After this short pause, the veteran drivers of the Red Ball were recognized as some of the most experienced transport personnel in the entire Army. Their skills were too valuable to be left idle. They were quickly reassigned to new duties, hauling supplies from the newly opened port of Antwerp and the rapidly expanding railheads to the ever-advancing front line. Their work continued to be vital, especially during the harsh winter of 1944 and the surprise German offensive in the Ardennes, known as the Battle of the Bulge. The legacy for the machines was far more brutal. The fleet of nearly 6,000 GMC trucks had been sacrificed for the sake of speed and tonnage. The vast majority of them were completely worn out. Their engines were shot, their transmissions were broken, and their chassis were bent and cracked from chronic overloading. The maintenance depots were filled with thousands of these exhausted vehicles, many of which were deemed beyond repair. The deadline graveyards grew even larger. These trucks were stripped of any salvageable parts, tires, spark plugs, carburetors, to keep the rest of the Army's vehicle fleet running. The carcasses were then often bulldozed into massive pits or simply abandoned. It was a stark illustration of the American military's philosophy. Equipment was expendable, victory was not. In terms of recognition, the story is mixed. At the time, the Red Ball Express was not widely celebrated. Logistics is rarely as glamorous as combat. While the drivers received praise from commanders like Patton and Eisenhower, there were no specific medals or ribbons for serving on the Express. For the African American soldiers who formed the majority of the drivers, the return to the segregated reality of the rear echelons was a bitter pill. Despite their heroic and vital service, they still faced the same discrimination as before. The immediate legacy of the Red Ball was practical, not ceremonial. It had succeeded in its primary mission. It had kept the Allied armies moving. It had prevented a stalemate and enabled the liberation of France and Belgium. It had fundamentally changed the way the Army thought about logistics, proving the immense potential of motorized transport. The full appreciation of its legend would only come many years later. Years after the guns fell silent, when historians and military analysts began to dissect the Second World War, they sought to understand the keys to Allied victory. In this post-war analysis, the testimony of the defeated German generals provided some of the most compelling insights. During interrogations and in their post-war memoirs, high-ranking German commanders repeatedly expressed a sense of sheer awe and bewilderment at the scale and efficiency of Allied logistics. At the top of their list of logistical marvels was the Red Ball Express. General Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt, the supreme German commander in the West, was blunt in his assessment. He admitted that the German High Command had completely underestimated the Allies' ability to supply their forces after the Normandy breakout. He and his staff had been certain that the advance would culminate in a logistical collapse, creating the opportunity for a decisive German counterattack. The fact that this collapse never happened, he conceded, was a source of constant frustration and a major factor in their defeat. General Hasso von Manteuffel, a brilliant panzer commander who would later lead the main thrust in the Battle of the Bulge, spoke specifically about the psychological impact of Allied supply. He described how his own elite panzer divisions were frequently immobilized for lack of a few tons of fuel, while watching the Americans operate with what seemed like a limitless supply. He called the Red Ball Express a brilliant improvisation and admitted that the German army, with its more rigid structure, would have been incapable of mounting a similar operation. But perhaps the most telling comments came from General Alfred Jodl, chief of the operations staff of the German Armed Forces High Command. At the Nuremberg trials, when questioned about the reasons for Germany's defeat, he spoke less of specific battles and more of the overwhelming material superiority of the Allies. He acknowledged that Germany could not compete with American production. The Red Ball Express was, for him, the perfect symbol of this disparity. It wasn't just about having more trucks. It was about the ability to organize them, fuel them, maintain them, and run them in a system that functioned like a massive, continental-scale factory. To the German military mind, which prized precision and planning, the Red Ball's seemingly chaotic but brutally effective nature was both baffling and terrifying. It represented a form of warfare they were unequipped to fight. This postmortem from the enemy is perhaps the most powerful testament to the Red Ball's success. It confirms that the German leadership was not just outfought, but fundamentally outthought and outsupplied, and that the constant rumble of those GMC trucks on the roads of France was the sound of their impending doom. Why do we still talk about the Red Ball Express today? Why has this 83-day logistical operation become one of the enduring legends of the Second World War? The answer is that it represents something much larger than just a successful military supply run. It has become a powerful symbol of several key aspects of the Allied victory and the American experience in the 20th century. First and foremost, the Red Ball Express is the ultimate symbol of American industrial might. It was the physical manifestation of the arsenal of democracy. It demonstrated that the United States could not only outproduce its enemies in terms of tanks, planes, and ships, but could also create and sustain a logistical system on a scale the world had never seen before. It was a victory of the assembly line as much as the front line. The simple, rugged GMC truck, produced in the hundreds of thousands, became an icon of this power. Second, it is a testament to American ingenuity and improvisation. The Red Ball was not a plan that was developed over years in a military war college. It was an audacious, ad hoc solution to a desperate crisis, conceived and implemented in a matter of weeks. It showed a flexibility and a can-do spirit that was a hallmark of the American military at its best. It broke the traditional rules of logistics and created a new paradigm out of necessity. Third, the story of the Red Ball Express is a crucial chapter in the history of the American civil rights movement. It is a story of African American soldiers who, in the face of systemic discrimination, performed their duty with extraordinary courage and skill. Their vital contribution to the war effort helped to expose the hypocrisy of a segregated military and provided powerful ammunition for the post-war fight for integration and equality. They were, in every sense of the word, liberators, fighting for freedom in Europe while simultaneously advancing the cause of freedom at home. Finally, we remember the Red Ball Express because it honors the unsung heroes of war. History rightly celebrates the soldiers who fight on the front lines, the pilots who duel in the skies, and the sailors who brave the seas. But wars are won and lost in the rear echelons, by the men and women who handle the gritty, unglamorous work of supply. The drivers, mechanics, MPs, and planners of the Red Ball Express were these heroes. Their battlefield was a dusty or muddy road. Their enemies were fatigue and mechanical failure, and their courage was the quiet, stubborn determination to get the job done. The legend of the Red Ball Express endures because it is a story of ordinary men and ordinary machines, summoned by extraordinary circumstances to achieve the impossible, and, in doing so, to change the course of history.